Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're not just dipping our toes, we are plunging headfirst into a historical conversation that's, well, it's anything but static.
That's right. History's rarely set in stone, is it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And right now, in July 2025, the very interpretation of history, particularly in the Western world, it seems to be undergoing this seismic, often really challenging transformation. We're talking about a concept that has, truly moved from the quiet, sometimes dusty corners of academia right into the roaring mainstream public discourse.
Decolonizing history.
Precisely, decolonizing history. And it's sparking fervent, passionate, and let's be honest, often difficult debates.
Absolutely. In very real places, too.
Yeah, tangible spaces like our grand museums, our most prominent public monuments, and even, what our children are learning in schools. It's everywhere.
It really is.
So our mission in this deep dive is to try and dissect this incredibly complex, kind of multifaceted movement.
Yeah, unpack it a bit.
Exactly. We're going to explore its profound motivations, its very real-world manifestations, and crucially, the diverse, sometimes conflicting perspectives surrounding it.
It's definitely not monolithic.
No, not at all. We promise you a deep dive that's firmly rooted in, solid historical context and contemporary analysis. We're really aiming for a nuanced, balanced understanding of why these historical topics are so undeniably hot in the West right now.
Trying to see all sides.
Right. Ultimately, our goal is to foster a constructive dialogue for you, our listener, on how we collectively approach our shared, often contested past.
A tough but necessary conversation.
Okay, so let's unpack this. To truly understand why decolonizing history has become such a pressing, sort of unavoidable issue today, we absolutely need to go back.
To the roots, yeah. The historical context is key.
The long and enduring shadow of colonialism. If we cast our minds back to the Age of Empires, roughly 16th to 20th centuries?
Roughly, yeah. A huge span of time.
We see European powers embarking on this relentless, massive global expansion. And this wasn't just, planting flags on maps.
No, far from it. It was systematic, often brutal.
It was a systematic, often brutal process of immense accumulation. You think of the vast territorial reach of the British Empire, right?
Yeah.
Or the cultural assimilation efforts under French colonial rule.
And the scramble for Africa, carving up a whole continent?
Exactly. These weren't just like footnotes in history books.
No, they had profound, lasting consequences.
Colonial powers amassed incredible wealth, extracted vast natural resources. I mean, you think of the rubber in the Congo under Belgian rule, or
the silver from Potosi by the Spanish, spices from Indonesia. The list goes on.
It does. And critically for our discussion today, countless cultural artifacts. It's vital to remember that this acquisition rarely, if ever, happened through fair exchange.
That's a crucial point. It was overwhelmingly through conquest, through exploitation of labor and land.
Unequal treaties, forced exchanges. Sometimes literally at the barrel of a gun.
Right. It was a system fundamentally designed for extraction, both material and cultural.
And the ripples of that system are still felt today. Physically and culturally. You can't escape it.
You really can't. And what's particularly illuminating here is how these historical processes directly led to the genesis, the very structure, of many prominent Western museums we admire today.
Right. The big names.
Exactly. Institutions like the British Museum, the Louvre, countless ethnographic museums across Europe and North America, they were, to a significant extent, built upon collections acquired during these colonial periods.
So the objects didn't just appear there?
No. These were often objects obtained through what we now widely acknowledge as looting, or through highly imbalanced transactions that really amounted to forced, coercive exchanges.
Could you give an example?
Well, think about the vast collections of ethnographic objects from Africa, Oceania, the Americas. These weren't simply donated or purchased in the way we understand those terms today. They were often taken from sacred sites, from battlefields, or gathered during dubious scientific expeditions that, frankly, served colonial interests.
Right, under the guise of research, perhaps.
Often, yes. So while these institutions certainly became, and, they continue to be, vital centers of knowledge, research, and conservation.
They hold incredible things.
They do. But they also played a significant, if less acknowledged, role in shaping and often actually distorting historical narratives.
How so?
While they frequently presented colonized cultures primarily through a Western Eurocentric lens, this approach often stripped objects of their original spiritual, social, and cultural contexts.
Took them out of their world.
Precisely. de-emphasizing their creators' agency and meaning, and instead categorizing them as maybe primitive curiosities or sometimes universal art, which sounds inclusive but actually obscures their original meanings and perpetuates a kind of hierarchical view of human civilization.
Okay, I see.
So it's precisely this historical acquisition process and the subsequent re-narration that is a direct precursor to today's fervent, urgent demands for repatriation.
Calls to return things.
Exactly. The very foundations of these grand collections are now being meticulously scrutinized, not just for how they were acquired, but for the stories they've historically told and perhaps failed to tell.
And it wasn't just inside museum walls that these narratives were being crafted, was it?
Oh, absolutely not.
We saw similar patterns, arguably even more pervasive, literally etched into the public landscape.
Out in the open, yeah.
Public monuments and imperial narratives were designed to be, well, inescapable. We're talking about public statues, street names, commemorative sites.
Things you walk past every day.
Exactly. And they historically celebrated figures directly associated with colonial expansion, the transatlantic slave trade, or the reinforcement of racial hierarchies.
Think of someone like Cecil Rhodes, perhaps.
Yeah, a statue of Cecil Rhodes overlooking an African university he helped found, but whose policies were deeply problematic.
Or monuments to Christopher Columbus in the Americas.
Figures whose legacies are now intensely debated.
Right. These weren't just like decorative elements. They served a very specific, deliberate purpose.
Which was?
To reinforce a particular, often triumphalist and highly selective national historical narrative within the colonizing nations. They were overt symbols of power, of conquest, and of a dominant, often white supremacist view of history.
Essentially telling people who mattered.
Implicitly instructing generations on who deserved honor and who was to be forgotten or subjugated. Yeah.
Exactly. And that triumphalist, Eurocentric narrative didn't stop at public squares. It extended deep into the educational system, shaping the minds of future generations.
Oh, the schools. Yes. Traditional history curricula in Western schools presented a largely Eurocentric view of global history. Now, this wasn't always born of outright malicious intent, you know?
It was just the way things were taught.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
But the systemic effect was that it often downplayed or entirely omitted the experiences, perspectives, and profound contributions of colonized peoples.
So a very one-sided story.
Very much so. Imagine learning about the age of exploration without understanding the sophisticated pre-colonial empires in Africa, like Mali or Songhai, or the vast scientific advancements of the Abbasid Caliphate.
Or the devastating impact of European diseases and forced labor on indigenous populations in the Americas.
Precisely. Indigenous histories, the profound and brutal realities of the transatlantic slave trade from the perspective of the enslaved, the complex civilizations that existed long before European arrival, these narratives were either marginalized, whitewashed, or completely absent.
Just not part of the main story.
Right. This created a skewed, incomplete, and often deeply biased understanding of the past for generations of students, essentially teaching them only one side of a multifaceted global story.
Which has consequences.
Huge consequences. It contributed to a kind of collective amnesia about the true costs and lasting repercussions of the colonial past, inadvertently reinforcing existing power structures by omitting inconvenient truths.
So people just didn't know.
For many, it's only now, maybe years after formal education, that they are truly encountering these hidden histories, leading to a profound reevaluation of everything they thought they knew.
Okay, right. Here's where it gets really interesting. With that comprehensive historical context now firmly in mind, what does decolonization actually look like on the ground today, in July 2025?
Yeah, the practical application.
Because it's far from one single monolithic demand, isn't it?
Not at all. It's more like a dynamic, multifaceted constellation of interconnected efforts.
Manifesting in really tangible, often contentious ways across different arenas. And it's not always a unified front either. There are diverse opinions within the movement itself about what true decolonization entails.
That's a key point, too.
Perhaps the most prominent and certainly one of the most talked about manifestations is museum repatriation and restitution, that insistent call for return.
Yes, the artifacts and remains.
The core demand here is straightforward, yet profoundly complex. Western museums returning cultural artifacts and human remains to their countries and communities of origin.
It's fundamentally about acknowledging historical injustice.
And reconnecting cultural patrimony with its rightful owners and contexts. Yeah. We've seen this play out in high-profile cases that dominate headlines. You mentioned the Benin Bronzes earlier.
Yes, thousands of exquisite brass and ivory sculptures looted during a brutal British punitive expedition in 1897.
And Nigeria has specific, persistent demands for the return from British, German, and other European museums.
And Germany has started returning some, which is significant. The British Museum, though, cites its foundational act and a duty to universal heritage, and has largely resisted full repatriation.
A very contentious point. Then there's Greece's long-standing, unwavering claims for the return of the Parthenon Marbles from the British Museum.
The Elgin Marbles, yeah. A debate that's raged for decades, now amplified by this renewed sense of cultural sovereignty.
And it's not just ancient civilizations either, is it?
No, absolutely not. There's significant ongoing movement on the repatriation of indigenous artifacts and ancestral remains held in North American museums back to their tribal communities.
Honoring deep cultural ties and ancestral rights, often under legislation like NAGPRA in the United States.
Exactly. NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, has been pivotal there.
So this brings us to a crucial point and raises an important question. What are the core arguments in this deeply contentious debate? Because you hear strong points on both sides.
You really do. On one side, you have powerful, historically rooted arguments. There's the argument from historical injustice, the assertion that these objects were acquired through illegitimate, often violent means.
So keeping them continues the injustice.
Essentially, yes, that their continued retention perpetuates that original wrong. Then there's the emphasis on cultural patrimony. Meaning these artifacts are vital, irreplaceable parts of a nation's or a community's identity, its living history, often its spiritual heritage. They argue these things belong within their original cultural context, where their true meaning can be understood and their cultural significance can continue to evolve.
Not just locked in a glass case far away.
Right. And this also touches on the fundamental ethical question of ownership, who truly owns these pieces of history and culture. It shifts the paradigm from mere possession by a museum to belonging to a people or place.
Okay, those are powerful arguments. But what about the other side, the museums holding these objects?
Well, you hear equally forceful counter-arguments. One prominent argument is for universal access to heritage.
The idea that everyone should be able to see them.
Kind of. Suggesting that major encyclopedic museums provide a global platform for diverse audiences to appreciate these works, transcending national borders and fostering a, quote, shared understanding of humanity.
But who defines universal?
Exactly. That's the critical lens. Who defines universal and for whose benefit? Critics argue this can inadvertently perpetuate a colonial framework, where the center, the Western Museum, still holds the power of interpretation and display, effectively dictating access.
Right. What else do they argue?
You also hear concerns raised about the preservation capabilities of institutions in the countries of origin.
Questioning if they can look after them properly.
Yes. Questioning if they have the resources, the climate control, the infrastructure to properly care for these delicate artifacts. Now, this claim is often vehemently disputed.
I can imagine.
It's often seen as deeply paternalistic by claimant nations, who point to significant investments in modern museum infrastructure and highly trained conservationists in their own countries.
Okay. Any other major arguments?
And finally, there's the slippery slope question.
Where does it stop?
Precisely. The fear that if one significant object is returned, it will open the floodgates for countless others, potentially emptying out major museum collections and fundamentally altering their purpose as world museums.
So these are not easy questions.
Not at all. Each side presents compelling points that have to be weighed against historical context, ethical responsibilities, and the sort of evolving nature of cultural stewardship in the 21st century.
Okay. So beyond the museum walls, another major arena of debate is this fundamental reevaluation of public monuments and place names.
Yes, the statues and street signs.
The core demand here is for the removal, or the critical recontextualization, or maybe the radical reinterpretation of statues, street names, and other public symbols linked to slavery, colonialism, or other deeply controversial historical acts.
And we've seen this explode into public consciousness with immense force, haven't we?
Absolutely. Often fueled by moments of heightened social and racial justice awareness. Think of the highly prominent debates over statues of figures like Christopher Columbus, especially across the Americas.
Right. His legacy is seen very differently now by many.
For many, his legacy is inextricably tied to the devastating impact of colonization on indigenous populations, violence, disease, exploitation, making his glorification deeply offensive.
Then there was the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, UK.
Yes, the widely publicized removal of his statue, a notorious 17th century slave trader. His monument became this dramatic focal point for Black Lives Matter protests in 2020.
Pulled down by demonstrators and rolled into the harbor. A very symbolic moment.
Extremely. And of course, the ongoing wrenching discussions around Confederate general statues in the U.S.
Which for many Black Americans represent a painful legacy of slavery and white supremacy, glorifying those who fought to maintain human bondage.
So this isn't just about aesthetics or, preserving history in amber.
No, it's about the very symbols a society chooses to uplift and honor in its public spaces, and what those choices communicate about its values today.
Right, which creates this significant, often raw tension. It's frequently framed by critics as
cancel culture.
Exactly. Versus a vital push for historical accountability and confronting symbols of oppression.
Those advocating for removal or radical recontextualization argue that these monuments inflict ongoing harm by glorifying figures who committed atrocities or perpetuated systemic injustice.
So keeping them up isn't neutral.
They'd argue it's not neutral at all. They see removal or change as a necessary step to acknowledge a more truthful, painful, and inclusive history. They assert that monuments aren't history books, they're acts of public veneration.
So the argument is, we're not erasing history.
We're debating how we remember it and who we choose to venerate.
Yeah. Conversely, what do opponents say?
Well, opponents often argue that removing statues is an attempt to erase history, to cancel historical figures regardless of their complex context.
That it's an attack on national heritage or identity.
Sometimes, yes. They might argue that instead of removal, these monuments should serve as educational tools, perhaps with additional plaques or interpretive information, to provide a more complete historical understanding of the figure and their era.
Put it in context.
Right. However, critics of that approach often counter that a plaque, however well written, can never truly counter the powerful, unstated message of glorification inherent in a towering statue.
The visual impact is too strong.
Potentially, yes. So the debate highlights this fundamental disagreement about how a society should grapple with difficult aspects of its past and the present, and whether symbols of oppression can ever truly become tools for liberation simply by adding context. It's a deep disagreement.
Absolutely. And it's not just about what we take down or what we bring back. It's also fundamentally about what we choose to put in.
Into the narrative itself.
Into our narratives, into our educational systems, into our collective understanding. This leads us to the crucial, overarching effort of diversifying and recentering historical narratives, pushing for a broader, more truthful canvas of human experience.
Getting more voices heard.
The core demand here is to include more diverse voices, perspectives, and experiences in historical accounts, especially those of marginalized groups whose stories have been systematically omitted or distorted.
Indigenous peoples, enslaved communities.
Women, LGBTQ+ individuals, diaspora communities, histories that were often sidelined, suppressed, or outright ignored in traditional Eurocentric tellings of the past. In education, this means concrete, ongoing efforts to revise history textbooks and curricula to reflect a more inclusive and truly global understanding of the past.
So changing what kids learn.
Yeah. Ensuring that when students learn about, say, the age of exploration, they also learn about the thriving civilizations that existed before European contact, their complex societies, their science, the devastating impact of colonialism and disease from their perspective.
Challenging those old myths of empty lands or benevolent civilizing missions.
Exactly. We're seeing changes in syllabus content, in the sources students are encouraged to read, and the very questions they are taught to ask about the past. It's a pedagogical shift.
And in museums.
In museums and exhibitions, we're witnessing profound curatorial shifts. This includes presenting artifacts not just as, art objects, but with rich contextual information from their originating cultures.
Bringing their meaning back.
Yes, incorporating indigenous languages into displays and critically, actively involving descendant communities in the interpretation and presentation of their own heritage.
Collaboration, not just curation about them.
Right. Co-curation, co-ownership of narratives, empowering the voices of those whose heritage has been historically silenced. It's a fundamental move from presenting about these cultures to presenting with them, and in some cases, truly for them, fostering a collaborative stewardship of global heritage.
That's a huge shift. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this isn't just about adding a few new facts or names to the history books.
No, it feels deeper than that.
It's about fundamentally moving beyond Eurocentrism to foster a more interconnected, multi-perspectival, and ultimately more accurate view of world history.
Can you unpack Eurocentrism a bit in this context?
Sure. Eurocentrism in this context is essentially an epistemological bias, a bias in how we know things that positions European history, culture, and thought as the default or the dominant lens through which all other histories should be viewed.
Like Europe is the center of the story.
Exactly. Often implicitly framing non-European experiences as peripheral, less advanced, or only relevant in relation to Europe.
Okay.
By consciously incorporating diverse perspectives, we gain a much richer, more complex, and more truthful understanding of global interactions, power dynamics, cultural exchanges, and the profound impact of historical events like colonialism.
Seeing the whole picture.
Right. It challenges the assumption of a singular, linear historical progression towards Western ideals. Instead, it reveals the intricate tapestry of human experience, full of parallel developments, mutual influences, and multifaceted contributions from all corners of the globe.
So it changes how we see the world's development.
Fundamentally. This shift allows for a more comprehensive and empathetic engagement with history, recognizing the agency, resilience, and contributions of all peoples, and importantly, revealing how the past continues to shape the present in profoundly unequal ways.
It's about understanding the world, not just a portion of it.
From more complete vantage points, exactly.
Okay. So, with all these efforts underway, museums, monuments, narratives, what does this all mean for our current moment? Why are these debates, which, as we've noted, have simmered for decades in academic circles, why are they exploding into the mainstream with such intensity now in July 2025?
That's the critical question, isn't it? Why the urgency now?
It feels like a perfect storm.
It does, and there are several powerful contemporary catalysts at play. One of the most significant is undoubtedly the increased global awareness of racial and social justice issues.
Like Black Lives Matter.
Precisely. Movements like Black Lives Matter, sparked by specific acts of violence and systemic injustice, have brought a renewed, urgent, and frankly undeniable focus on systemic inequalities.
And people are connecting those inequalities to history.
Directly. Many now recognize these inequalities as directly tied to historical colonial legacies. The protests over the murder of George Floyd, for instance, didn't just highlight police brutality, they ignited a global conversation about the enduring structures of racism.
Which have deep roots.
Which, in many Western nations, are rooted in the transatlantic slave trade and colonial exploitation. This made the historical roots of contemporary injustice undeniable, and brought the demand for historical reckoning out of the academy and onto the streets.
Forcing institutions to look at themselves.
Absolutely, forcing public institutions to confront their own colonial blind spots. It's no longer just an academic discussion, it's a lived reality for millions, making the historical roots of injustice impossible to ignore.
And that's coupled with the growing influence of academic ideas, right? Decolonial theory.
Yes, absolutely. Decolonial theory. Academic thought, which for decades has challenged traditional historical narratives and critiqued colonial power structures, is now permeating public consciousness more than ever before.
So ideas from thinkers like Fanon or Said.
Yes, thinkers like Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, and also key Latin American scholars like Aníbal Quijano, Walter Mignolo, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. They've laid the groundwork for understanding what's sometimes called the coloniality of power.
Meaning?
The idea that even after formal political independence, colonial forms of power, knowledge, and even ways of being persist, it's a framework that fundamentally critiques the enduring hierarchical structures and knowledge systems that remain long after the flags change.
And these ideas are spreading.
They are. Once confined to specialized journals and university seminars, they're now spreading through various channels, mainstream media, popular activism, art, broader educational initiatives outside universities.
So concepts like epistemic violence.
Exactly. Concepts like epistemic violence, the suppression of non-Western ways of knowing or decolonizing the mind, are becoming part of everyday conversation. This makes more people aware of the foundational critiques of Eurocentric history and compels them to reconsider how knowledge itself has been produced and disseminated through a colonial lens.
And the digital age must play a role here too.
Oh, massively. The digital age and global connectivity play a truly huge accelerative role. Social media platforms, digital archives, online communities,
They're incredibly powerful tools.
incredibly. They allow for the rapid, often unfiltered dissemination of information, historic research, personal testimonies from marginalized communities, calls to action stuff that would have been impossible to share so widely just a few decades ago.
And they help people organize.
Critically, yes. They enable the swift mobilization of communities and activists, significantly amplifying calls for historical reevaluation from diverse communities globally. A local protest over a statue, a viral video showing historical injustice, an online petition for restitution.
Can become an international headline overnight.
In hours, sometimes, putting immense pressure on institutions and governments to respond and accelerating the pace of change. It's kind of decentralized historical authority, giving voice to those previously unheard.
And we absolutely can't ignore the changing demographics within Western societies themselves, can we?
No, that's a fundamental factor. These societies are becoming increasingly diverse, reflecting centuries of migration, post-colonial diasporas, and global interconnection.
So more people demanding different stories.
Exactly. This demographic shift naturally leads to a greater demand for historical narratives that accurately reflect the experiences, contributions, and perspectives of all citizens, not just a dominant, often historically European group.
Younger generations might be less accepting of the old narratives.
It seems so. Younger, more diverse generations are often less willing to accept historical narratives that exclude their ancestors or glorify figures responsible for their oppression. People want to see their own histories, their ancestors' stories, reflected as central to the national narrative.
Fostering a more inclusive sense of identity.
And belonging for everyone living in these societies today.
And critically, driving much of this is the dialogue coming from the Global South. Right.
Yes, the increasingly assertive and unified dialogue from the Global South. Former colonized nations and communities are no longer simply passive recipients of Western historical narratives or silent claimants for their patrimony.
They're demanding action.
They are increasingly vocal, organized, and assertive in demanding accountability for past harms and, perhaps most tangibly, the return of their cultural patrimony.
And their voices are being heard more now.
Yes. Amplified by digital connectivity and growing diplomatic influence through forums like the African Union or specific bilateral negotiations, their voices are now more effectively heard globally. They are compelling Western nations to seriously address these long-standing demands, often backed by legal and ethical frameworks that challenge the very premises of colonial acquisition.
It's not a one-way street anymore.
Not at all. It's a truly global dialogue where historical justice is being sought on a much larger, more equitable stage, recognizing the sovereignty and cultural rights of these nations.
Okay, this conversation, as we've clearly established, is incredibly complex. It's deeply emotional. And it presents both significant challenges and maybe profound opportunities for societal growth. How do we navigate this path forward, especially when passions run so high?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
One of the immediate challenges seems to be simply defining decolonization itself.
Yes, the term itself can be ambiguous.
It means different things to different people, leading to very different interpretations and expectations.
Absolutely. For some, it might mean the literal return of every single object taken during colonial times. For others, it could be about a fundamental shift in institutional power or a complete overhaul of how history is taught.
Does it mean destruction of old symbols, removal, re-education, a systemic shift in power?
All of the above, depending on who you ask. These different interpretations can lead to confusion and even conflict among those who ostensibly share the goal of decolonization, making unified action quite difficult sometimes.
And what's often overlooked, maybe, and what's fascinating here, is how the very definition of decolonization can become a point of deep contention, even internal friction within the movement itself.
How so?
Well, for certain groups, decolonization is primarily about the physical stuff, the return of objects, the removal of monuments, tangible acts of restorative justice.
Okay.
For others, though, it's about a deeper, more profound transformation of institutional structures, curricula, ways of knowing, essentially dismantling that coloniality of power in all its forms.
So structural change versus symbolic change sometimes?
In a way, yes. And that divergence means different groups are pushing for vastly different outcomes. Finding common ground can be incredibly difficult when the goal itself is interpreted so broadly.
So the concept is still evolving?
It feels like it's still being shaped through ongoing dialogue, debate, and practical implementation. often forcing difficult compromises or maybe prioritizing certain forms of decolonization over others.
And because of these strong feelings and diverse interpretations, the path forward often involves intense, sometimes difficult dialogue.
But regrettably, it can also escalate into heated confrontation.
Yes, these debates are incredibly passionate. They touch on deep-seated national identities, historical trauma, questions of collective guilt and responsibility.
Which makes respectful dialogue crucial.
Absolutely crucial. Fostering respectful dialogue, cultivating genuine empathy across different experiences, and encouraging constructive engagement between different viewpoints. Otherwise, progress can stall, and the conversation can devolve into unproductive accusations rather than meaningful solutions, risking further polarization in societies already grappling with deep divisions.
Okay. Beyond the theoretical and emotional debates, there are the immense, very real practicalities, especially around repatriation.
The logistics, yeah.
If we're seriously considering returning potentially thousands of artifacts, which many institutions and nations are now pursuing, it's a truly monumental undertaking.
Huge logistical, legal, and financial complexities.
Right. Think about the intricate questions. Where will these objects be housed securely and conserved appropriately upon return? Especially delicate artifacts.
Who pays for the incredibly expensive, specialized transport and insurance required for priceless, fragile objects?
And the legal side. What are the precise legal frameworks for ownership transfer? You're navigating decades or centuries of Western legal claims versus indigenous customary laws or international conventions.
Like the 1970 UNESCO Convention or the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention on Stolen or Illegally Exported Cultural Objects.
So it's not just handing things back in a box.
Far from it. It's a long, involved process requiring unprecedented international cooperation, significant financial resources, and dedicated expertise. It demands new models of collaboration, not just simple handovers.
Which raises a profoundly important question, and perhaps the ultimate challenge. How deep are societies willing to go in this process?
Beyond the symbols.
Exactly. Because while removing statues and returning cultural artifacts are incredibly important symbolic and material gestures of restorative justice, many argue that true decolonization goes far beyond these tangible acts.
It needs to address ongoing systemic inequalities.
And historical harms that are direct, enduring legacies of colonialism. This means grappling with profound issues like persistent economic disparities between the global North and South.
Educational disadvantages for marginalized communities, healthcare access gaps, land rights disputes.
And even discussions of financial reparations alongside cultural restitution.
Right. If a nation benefited immensely, often brutally, from centuries of colonial exploitation, should it not also contribute to redressing the long-term imbalances and intergenerational trauma it created, not just return the stolen objects?
It demands a deeper reckoning.
A deeper reckoning with persistent economic and social disparities rooted in colonial history, rather than just focusing on the visible symbols. It forces a look at the enduring structural inequalities.
So as we look to the future of heritage and how history is told, a crucial, perhaps defining question emerges. How can Western institutions responsibly steward global heritage in the future?
While simultaneously addressing these profound historical injustices and building more inclusive narratives that truly represent humanity's collective past.
It's about finding a dynamic, ethical balance between preservation, universal access in a truly equitable sense, and achieving historical justice.
Forging new partnerships, co-creating knowledge.
Fundamentally rethinking the very purpose and ownership of global cultural heritage.
Yeah, it's a massive task ahead.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, it seems clear the decolonizing history movement sweeping across the West reflects evolving societal values.
And a deeper, often uncomfortable, but entirely necessary reckoning with the legacies of empire and the historical injustices they spawned.
It is a challenging, but ultimately transformative and, vital process. It compels societies to confront uncomfortable truths about their past.
And redefine their collective identity in a more accurate, more responsible, and profoundly more equitable way.
And while the debates are often intense, fraught with emotion,
they represent a significant, undeniable opportunity to build a more accurate, inclusive, and ultimately more just understanding of history for everyone.
So as we conclude, something for you, our listener, to consider. What does it truly mean for you to have a just and informed historical consciousness in a world grappling with these complex, often uncomfortable legacies?
And perhaps even more importantly, what might your individual role be in shaping that more accurate, more inclusive, and ultimately more equitable understanding of our shared, multifaceted past?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.